So welcome everyone to Risk Management for Food Establishments. This has been our fourth or fifth webinar this winter, and we're really glad for you all to be joining us. We're from Perennia. You can switch, Cheryl or Shelly. Perennia is a Nova Scotia Crown corporation, and we support the growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, cannabis, and food and beverage sectors. I'm joined by my lovely colleagues, Cheryl and Shelly. Shelly is the co-manager of quality and food safety. She develops and facilitates quality and food safety training. She's passionate about educating clients and knowledge transfer. She assists clients with navigating food safety regulatory requirements, as well as third-party certifications. If you've ever taken training with Perennia, you will likely have seen Shelly, as she is our lead trainer as well. I'm also joined by Cheryl Andrews. She is a quality and food safety specialist here at Perennia. She helps clients in developing, implementing, validating, and maintaining all aspects of their HACCP-based food safety systems to meet regulatory and GFSI requirements for a wide range of commodities and services. Just a bit of housekeeping. So this session is being recorded. It will go up on our YouTube after this. Give me a few, maybe a day to edit it, and then it'll be right up on our YouTube. All participants, that means you, will have your audio and video turned off during the webinar. However, if you would like to ask a question, we have a Q&A there at the bottom of your screen, and we would love to hear your questions. We will answer some throughout as we find they're relevant, or save them at the end if we think it's better to give it more time at the end. If you think of a question later on that you didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to send us an email. I'll put it in the chat, and our specialists can help you out. So take it away.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining the risk management webinar. So today, Cheryl and I are going to talk about risk assessment and risk management and mitigation with you all. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the definition of a risk assessment. Risk assessment has been defined by Codex as being the scientific evaluation of known or potential adverse effects resulting from human exposure to foodborne hazards. So what does this mean? What is the risk? The risk isn't necessarily going to be a pathogenic bacteria. It could be a choking risk due to a physical hazard. It could be an allergenic risk because of a chemical hazard, or it could be a foodborne illness due to a pathogenic bacteria, or it could also be a foodborne intoxication due to toxin-producing bacteria. And some examples of bacteria that produce toxin, Staph aureus or Clostridium botulinum, are prime examples of that. So something to keep in mind when you are doing your risk assessment is basically you are identifying the hazard. And when you identify that hazard, then it is time to determine the risk of the hazard. And the way you do that is by looking at the likelihood. Another word that people use is probability. So you'll see us use that interchangeably, likelihood or probability, times by the severity of the risk. So hazards, first of all, you need to identify the hazard. What type of hazard are you worried about? Are you worried about a biological hazard? Are you worried about a chemical hazard or a physical hazard? So for those of you who are very familiar with food safety management systems and doing a hazard analysis, B, C, and P, biological, chemical, and physical hazards are going to be something that you are very familiar with. So you're looking at the condition and the food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. So some examples, when we talk about biological hazards, it's the pathogenic bacteria that we're worried about. It's not the good bacteria, because there are good bacteria out there, but it's the pathogenic ones. So it's not just a pathogenic bacteria, it can be a virus, parasite, fungi, mold. And then, of course, some examples of chemical hazards would be any processing aids that you're using, food additives, and keep in mind when using these are regulated by Health Canada. It is your cleaners that you're using. So ensuring you're using your cleaners at the appropriate concentrations so that you're not causing a chemical hazard. Sanitizers, pesticides, any potential allergens or cross contact. And then of course, radiological needs to be determined as well. And some examples of physical hazards could be bones, shells, hair, stones, insects, dirt, metal, jewelry, glass, wood, flaking paint, anything that should not be part of the food that can make its way in. So those extraneous matter. So risk, when we talk about risk, it's exactly what I had just mentioned. It is looking at the probability slash likelihood and timesing it by the severity. So obviously the higher that number is, the greater the risk is going to be. The lower the number, the lower the risk is going to be. So you will see a table later on that's looking at severity and likelihood to determine that risk level. Some companies use a 3x3, some use a 5x5. At the end of the day, guys, it really doesn't matter which one you're using as long as you're determining whether the risk is low, moderate, or high. So if you have a likelihood of 1 and you have a severity of 1, 1 times 1 is 1. If you have a likelihood of 3 and a severity of 3, 3 times 3 is 9. So that's going to be a greater risk, obviously. So some of the things you're looking at is, does it have potential adverse health effects? What are those potential adverse health effects? And what is the severity of those health effects?
So the risk assessment process, it involves 4 different things: hazard identification, hazard characterization, an exposure assessment, and risk characterization. So the hazard identification, it's just that. So it's identifying the hazard or hazards associated with the risk you're defining or you have defined. What is or are the identified hazard or hazards that you're going to be concerned about? Hazard characterization is where you determine how bad the hazard is. So what's the severity of the hazard? The exposure assessment is where you're going to perform a qualitative or quantitative evaluation of the degree of intake that's likely to occur from your hazard. For example, how many people have been exposed to the identified hazard? And the last part of the process is characterizing the risk. So what's the result when you integrate or combine all of these things? So hazard identification. During the hazard identification, you're going to describe the risk and list or identify all of your potential hazards that are associated with your risk. There could be a biological hazard. It could be a chemical hazard. Chemical hazards also include hazards related to allergens and radiological hazards, or there could be a physical hazard associated with your risk. The risk could have associated hazards from all 3 categories. So it could be biological, chemical, and physical, or it could only have one hazard with the risk. So you could have just a physical hazard associated with your risk. Are the risk hazards associated with, for example, a food fraud or a food terrorism event, or something else like not meeting or not fully meeting a clause in the standard that you're trying to meet? So be very detailed and specific when describing or identifying all of your associated hazards with the risk. Hazard characterization. So during the hazard characterization process, you're going to determine how bad the hazard is or how severe the impact could be from your hazard. For a biological hazard, you'll need to consider things like a dose response. So that means the relationship between the amount of exposure to a substance or a bacteria in this case, and the response. So in this case, the response is going to be your health. A couple of examples of this are the acceptable amount or the limit for salmonella in your finished product. So that's none. So salmonella must be absent in your finished product. So if salmonella is present in any amount in your finished product, this biological hazard would be quite significant if there was an exposure. The acceptable limit or range for staphylococci in, for example, fish and fish products for 5 sample units, that is 1 sample unit could be between 1,000 and 10,000 CFUs per gram. If you have more than one sample unit that is within this range, your entire lot is then unsatisfactory, and the biological hazard would be considered quite significant if there was an exposure. For a physical hazard, Health Canada considers 2 millimeters or greater as the threshold for consideration as a health risk. So if a foreign material was found in your product and it's greater than 2 millimeters, the physical hazard would then be quite significant if there was an exposure. So we take the significance of the hazards into account. It's a very important step in the risk assessment process. Significant hazards can have major impacts resulting in death. There could be a loss of license, for example. Other hazards could also have high impacts, such as recall, losing customers, causing a serious illness or an injury. Lower impacts from hazards could result in product holds, customer complaints, rework, or you may even determine that your hazard may have no impact once it's been evaluated or once it's been characterized. You might realize there actually is no impact. So that's the importance of doing that overall risk assessment.
Cheryl, we received a question, and I think it's useful to answer it right here. For someone not super familiar with risk and hazards yet, how would you define food fraud and food terrorism?
Food fraud is a risk, for example, of if your product is commonly affected by food fraud. So it could be a type of, we could use seafood, for example, where one fish looks like another fish. It could be dilution, so where you purchase olive oil or what you think is olive oil, but there had been other vegetable oils included, things like that.
I'm just going to jump in there and say that food fraud and food terrorism are both intentional. However, food fraud is for economical gain. So people purposely use certain mechanisms to do things to the product for economic gain. And some examples of those mechanisms may be mislabeling. It may be, like Cheryl said, labeling a fish as a more expensive when it's actually a cheaper fish. It could be diluting a product. And then, of course, your food terrorism is also intentional, but it's not done for economic gain, but they are intentionally doing something to your product, whether it is adding a biological hazard, chemical hazard, or physical hazard to intentionally harm the general public.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Shelly. Exposure assessment. So the exposure assessment evaluates how much exposure there was to the hazard, and it takes into consideration some of the following examples. So where's your product sold? Was it sold only in Nova Scotia, which has a population of approximately 1 million people? Was it sold across Canada, which has a population of approximately 40 million? Was it sold across Canada and the United States, which has a combined population of approximately 380 million people? So what volume of product was sold? So now we know that not every single person is going to be a buyer of your product. Ideally, they would be, but this is just an example of how the volume of product sold would be much greater if you distribute it across Canada and the US versus just sold your product within Nova Scotia. In this case, many more people would have exposure to your product or products, which increases your risk. Is there more than one product affected? So how many products do you have that were affected by your risk or your hazards? If more than one product's affected, you would be exposing more people than if only one product was affected. What hazards are present and how severe or significant is the hazard? Does or will the hazard have a major impact? Will it have a moderate impact? Could it have low impact or no impact? What's the food intake amount? So how much of the affected product was consumed by how many people? Now that you can see how the exposure assessment affects the evaluation of your defined risk and identified associated hazards. Risk characterization. So now that you've dug into your hazard identification, you've characterized your hazards, and you've done your exposure assessment, you have a lot of valuable information here that you've brought to light. So all of this information that you've gathered is then compiled or integrated into characterizing the overall risk. So in other words, what's the result of the integration or combination of all these things and all of this information? So with all your information and integration, you can characterize the overall risk with a risk rating and risk criticality rating. The risk rating takes into account the likelihood or probability, as Shelly mentioned, and the severity of the hazard or the hazards. The risk criticality takes into account the detectability of the hazard or hazards and the risk rating. So Shelly has a great visual of this, and she'll dig a little bit more into it on the next slide.
Thanks, Cheryl. So, like I had mentioned, this is an example of a risk assessment chart. You don't have to use the 5x5. Some companies use a 3x3. At the end of the day, as long as you are able to determine that risk assessment, that's all the auditor and the inspector is going to care about. But for this example, you will see that we're using the 5x5. So I'm going to give you a real life example, and then I'm going to give you a food safety example. So if I was going to jump out of an airplane using a parachute, so I'm going skydiving, if we look at the severity here on the left-hand side, you will see that 1 says no health effect, 2 minor slight health effect, 3 major health effect, 4 single fatality, 5 multiple fatalities. So it's little old me that has decided to go skydiving. So it would be a 4, a single fatality if something was to happen. Now let's look at the likelihood and the probability of me plummeting to my death. If I was to go to a company that had 0 incidents, never ever had a fatality, never had an issue whatsoever, they have inspection reports on their parachute, they're able to provide you with the inspection reports, they do training with you, what would be the likelihood, that probability of me plummeting to my death? It's going to be here, right? Very unlikely or unlikely. So that's going to put me down here by, we would say 1 times 4 is 4. However, if I decided to be super cheap and go to a company that has had incidences, they don't inspect their parachutes, I've looked at the parachute and it's really rickety, then the likelihood and the probability of me plummeting to my death is going to be greater. So it's going to be more over here. If I decide to be a little crazy and jump out of that plane not wearing a parachute at all, then it is extremely likely that I'm going to plummet to my death. So if we go back to all the things Cheryl just talked about, the exposure, the characteristics, the hazard types, she had mentioned that a physical hazard, Health Canada sets a threshold for 2 millimeters as a physical hazard. So there's a lot of things you have to consider here. First of all, what is that vehicle? Basically, what type of food is that hazard in? So if you look at a food that it's a drink, you have a piece of glass or metal or some physical hazard in a liquid drink, then the likelihood of you having your severity being a major health effect is going to be down at it, like a 3, say. Could it be fatal? It all depends on what that hazard is. But the likelihood is going to be extremely likely that you're going to consume that because it's a drink. So you're drinking it down. Whereas if there was a physical hazard in, say, something like a burger, unless you're a seagull, we chew our food when we eat, right? So as we chew, we are more likely to find that product and spit it out. So then our probability likelihood is not here at a 5, but it's going to come to the left. And then, of course, if that physical hazard was found in a food like a spread, so say it's some kind of a sauce or a condiment that we're going to spread on a sandwich, then again, we're more likely to see that as we're putting that on our sandwich. So you see how it's going to depend on the vehicle, the exposure, and the characteristic. All of these will play a role in determining the risk assessment at the end of the day. Risk management. So when it comes to risk management, this is the process of weighing policy alternatives in the light of the results of risk assessment and, if required, selecting and implementing appropriate control options, including regulatory measures. And that is as per Codex. So basically what you're doing here is you've looked at the hazard, you've identified the risk. Now you're determining, do you have control measures in place so that you can manage that risk? I will tell you that depending on where you sell your product, there are different parts of the world that when you're doing your hazard analysis, you're not just looking at the risk based on the control measures you've put in place, but you're looking at the risk, so that likelihood and that severity before you have the control measures in place and then after you put the control measures in place. So basically, this is just one piece of the hazard analysis. You have to be identifying and assessing those hazards and the risks, and then, of course, putting control measures in place that's going to mitigate risk. Risk communication. So the interactive exchange of information and opinions concerning risk among risk assessors, risk managers, consumers, and other interested parties. So basically, it is when you need to know who you need to be communicating this information with and how should it be communicated. So for example, if you have a customer complaint because they found a physical hazard, you're going to want to do that investigation. You're going to want to look at the risk. How much product was affected by this? Who will this affect? Did you sell it outside of Nova Scotia? Did you sell it to Canada? Did you sell it within your home province, Canada, and internationally? And then, of course, you're going to want to get back to the person that did that customer complaint because they're going to want to know what you did about it. Over here, you'll see the HACCP decision tree for those of you who are very familiar with creating HACCP plans. So basically, when we talk about control measures, of course, you are going to do your risk management where you're looking at the likelihood and the severity and then coming up with that risk rating. And now it's time to say, okay, do we have control measures in place that will fully control the hazards? So the first piece is looking at your prerequisite programs. Do you have prerequisite programs? Another word for that is preventive controls or good manufacturing practices that are going to fully control the hazard and risk that you're worried about. When you do not have one of those, a preventive control, a prerequisite program, or a good manufacturing practice that is going to control the hazard and mitigate risk, then it is time to put a critical control measure in place. So there are a couple different ways of controlling the risk. It may be having a critical control point, and when you have a critical control point, then of course you're going to monitor that. You're going to ensure that you're following that critical limit. You're going to have your predetermined deviation in place, your verifications, and your records. Or if you're using your preventive controls to control that hazard, of course, you're going to have your records to show all the things that you are doing to prove that you are following your program and you're doing everything you possibly can to control that risk.
So when must risk assessments be completed? So they must be completed during your hazard analysis section of your HACCP plan, when you receive food safety related consumer or customer complaints, when there's a concern that a hazard you've identified internally can pose a risk to your consumer or customer, it's a good idea to complete a risk assessment. Whenever a requirement for a food safety management system cannot be fully met. When a food safety clause requires you to have one, so in some standards, there are some clauses that require you to have a documented risk assessment. Whenever a risk changes, when problem solving with your team or deciding on what course of action needs to be taken. So it's a good tool to use during those times. And always complete your risk assessment with your team. So whether that's your food safety team or your HACCP team, just don't do it alone. because it's very important to have a variety of expertise and different viewpoints to aid in your decision-making process and to work through any assessments and ratings accurately and efficiently when you're doing your risk assessment. So it's important to document your risk assessment to demonstrate the process you and your team went through, or the process that you used while you're working through your food safety risks, while you're doing problem solving, and while you're making critical decisions on a course of action to be taken. It's also a good idea to have a standard template you use to ensure that all steps and components are documented consistently each and every time a risk assessment is completed. So your documentation should include what the risk assessment's being completed for. So you want to describe the risk and all those potential hazards. So all those biological, chemical, and physical hazards. You also want to describe any and all control measures that you already have in place at your facility to control the hazards you identified for the risk. So a lot of times you have a lot of control measures already in place. Just make sure you document those. Describe how you verify each control measure you outlined as controlling the identified hazards. So if you're saying a control measure is in place to control one of these hazards, you need to be able to confirm and prove that it actually does control the hazard. You need to include the risk evaluation. So it's very helpful to use that risk matrix that we talked about to do this. However, don't just include the rating numbers from the matrix. You must also justify why you've chosen these ratings. So for example, why did you choose the severity rating you did? Also keep in mind that the risk rating is to be determined based on the risk before any control measures have been put in place, although we did talk about when you can include those ratings for after your control measures have been in place as well. Once you've determined the food safety risk based on the risk matrix, you may need to put additional control measures in place if what you currently have in place does not fully control those identified hazard or hazards. You may or may not need to implement additional control measures. It all depends on the significance of the risk, or you may not need to have any control measures in place if the risk is insignificant or negligible. So once you and your team completed the risk assessment, make sure you include a conclusion or an overall evaluation statement for the risk assessment. And this is going to highlight the outcome, and it's going to have a summary of your risk assessment, and then you're going to have your team sign off on it. Also be sure that when your risk assessment's completed, that you're going to have an effectiveness check completed or a verification that your current control measures, as well as any additional control measures you added to put in place to control the risk and the hazards, you need to make sure and prove that those have been effective. And also whether or not during this process, you might find that you had to complete a corrective action for something. So make sure you note all of those corrective actions or any corrective actions that needed to be taken. And make sure those are closed, but make sure you document all that stuff as well.
And another thing to keep in mind when you're identifying the risk and the potential hazards is putting the clause or the standard from the regulatory requirement or your third-party certification is really helpful as well. So when the auditor's going through and they're at, say, clause 354, you can say, yes, we have a risk assessment for this, and this is what the clause is supposed to be, and this is the risk assessment we've done.
So make sure you keep any of your risk assessments that you and your team have completed and documented on file. Make sure they're readily available in case they're requested during an audit or an inspection. The risk assessments used to determine the risk of a hazard prior to your control measures being implemented, and it outlines a final evaluation of the risk once all of your control measures, including any new or additional control measures, have been implemented and verified. So Carolyn's going to pop a link to her fact sheet on how to complete an effective risk assessment into the chat if she hasn't already. So you guys can all check that out later on, and it's a great reference tool.
I have a question related to this though. If an auditor or inspector doesn't ask to see all of the completed risk assessments, should you provide them anyway?
I'll take this one. So if they don't ask to see all of the completed risk assessments, no, during an inspection or audit, it's best practice to only present documentation that's been requested by your auditor or your inspector, or that you only present documentation to prove you meet the requirement that they're looking at the time. It's not necessary to provide things that don't pertain to what's being inspected or audited at that moment in time. But if it's requested, by all means, provide the supporting documentation you have on file.
Great, thank you.
Okay, a lot of people don't realize that their inspections, their CFIA regulatory inspections, are based on risk. And it is really advantageous for you folks to go into your CFIA, which is called My CFIA, and complete this risk assessment model questionnaire, as it will help CFIA inspectors determine whether you are lower risk or higher risk, because that is also going to determine how often you are seeing these inspectors. So it's in your best interest to go on there and answer all those questions accurately, so that this model runs, basically it's based on algorithms. So the information that you put in there, it uses that data, and then it will run it through an algorithm, and then it will pop that out to the inspector to say that this establishment is high risk, this is low risk, this is moderate, and so on. So when they do this, it's looking at three different things. It's looking at the risk factors. So when we talk about risk factors, the food commodity, are you a maple processor? Are you meat and poultry? Are you a slaughter facility? Are you ready to eat? Are you confectionery? All of those different commodities have different risk ratings and levels. And we'll look at that too in a few more slides. What is happening at your operation and what risks are associated with your operation, as well as the manufacturing processes that you're doing. So like I said, are you making candy? Is it an abattoir? Maybe you're handling meat and poultry, but is it that you're doing ready to eat? Are you doing raw products? Are you slaughtering that animal? And then, of course, another factor that they're looking at is the mitigation strategies to control those risks. So some mitigation strategies may be that you're not just meeting the regulatory requirements, but you also have third-party audits coming in. You could have supplier audits as well. So, or sorry, your customer audits. Let's say MacDonald's comes in, or Costco, and so on. And then, of course, the establishment compliance information. So what that means is, what is the history of compliance with that particular establishment? So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how that works. How does that establishment risk assessment with CFIA work? How do they determine how often they're coming in? So you'll see on the left here, there's different risk factors that we talked about. So ensuring that you're filling this out accurately is going to help them determine the frequency. You don't want them coming in more often if they don't have to. And then, of course, they need to know if they do need to come in more often. So you need to be completely truthful when filling out this questionnaire. So those risk factors you need to look at. What is the type of activity you're doing at your facility? What is the commodity that you're processing? What types of products are you doing? What is the volume? Where are you sending that product? Are you keeping it intra-provincially? Are you sending it inter? Is it going international? And what are the different processing steps that are happening? And then, of course, we talked about those mitigation factors. So what processes do you have in place at your facility? Do you have third-party audits? Do you have additional food safety certificates? Are you sampling your product? Do you have a QA department there? So all of these different mitigation factors and those risk factors are going to come in play when determining your risk level. So the bottom picture here shows there's 7 different categories of risk as per CFIA. If you are under category 1, that is very high risk. And if you're category 7, then it is low risk. So obviously the higher risk you are, the more you're going to be seeing your CFIA inspectors. And the lower risk you are, the less likely you are to see your inspectors. So if you're high risk, you may be seeing them every quarterly, it could be 6 months. If you're lower risk, you might be seeing them once a year, or maybe it's every 2 years. So you'll see here, this bottom picture has a list of commodities. We have maple, honey, fruits and vegetables, egg, dairy, fish, meat, poultry slaughtering, and meat, poultry storage. So if you take a look to the left, it shows that meat and poultry slaughtering and processing is higher risk than something like honey or maple. So honey and maple are going to be down at 6 and 7. And of course, maple is going to be over towards the 7, and of course honey as well. And then if you look at the fish, it's going to depend on what you're doing with the fish. If you're doing ready to eat products, then see that little red band on number 2, you may fall there. If you're doing frozen fish, you may be over at the 6 or 7 category. So by putting the correct information in this questionnaire is going to help them determine how often they need to come in and assess your company. So when they come in, they're looking at all the different elements, and they're going to go through your entire PCP program, but it will be split out. It's not going to be looking at your entire preventive control plan in one go.
We received a question, Shelly and Cheryl, that I think is helpful to answer. How long should a company be keeping risk assessment records for?
That's a great question. So it is your retention period. So if you look at your food safety management system under the document control and record keeping, you're going to have a retention period there. And the retention period with Safe Food for Canadians, the preventive control plan, is 2 years or shelf life plus a year. So if your product is good for more than 2 years, obviously you're going to keep those records for 3 years. If your shelf life is 3 years, you'll have to keep it for 4 years.
And at the end of the useful life of those records, you have to redo the risk assessment. Is that how it works?
Oh, sorry. The risk assessment should be looked at on an annual basis.
Oh.
Or if anything changes, then you're going to go back in and look at that risk assessment before annual. But annually, yes, you should be looking at those risk assessments to determine if they are still adequate and appropriate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So we're going to take a look we talked about risk assessing, but also different commodities and different types of food are going to have different risk levels. So if we look at the public market, they have Schedule A, B, and C. Schedule A is potentially hazardous foods, and I'm not going to get into this too much because the next slide is all about Schedule A. But basically, these foods are going to require temperature control. So they need to be kept frozen or they need to be refrigerated. So they have a temperature requirement associated with them. Schedule B are not potentially hazardous foods. These are shelf-stable foods. They have a pH of 4.6 or below, so pathogenic bacteria are unlikely to be present due to that pH level, and the water activity is less than 0.85. So again, with bacteria, they're not likely to grow when that water activity is less than the 0.85. Schedule C presents the highest risk of all the different scheduled foods, and they are not permitted for sale in a public market. So if we look at some examples of what foods are under Schedule A, you're going to find meat and meat products. Obviously, these are perishable products. They're not shelf stable. Same with your fish and shellfish, poultry products, eggs, juices, ciders, milk, cheese, ready to eat fruits and vegetables, sandwiches. All of these require a temperature control. So it would be either refrigeration, keeping it under 4 degrees, or it would be in the freezer. So at least minus 18 degrees Celsius. Schedule B products, these are your shelf stable. So these are less likely to be hazardous. They are not products that require temperature control. And they are jams and jellies, baked goods and pastries, candies, confectionery, fudge, chocolates, and so on. Pasteurized fruit juices that are shelf stable. So you think of the little Tetra Packs that you send your kids to school with. Honey and maple products. So you did see on that CFIA slide, we showed you that the category of risk is a 6 or a 7 for those types of commodities, nut butter, coffee, and tea. And then if we look at Schedule C, this is the highest risk of all three of these categories. So out of Schedule A, B, and C, Schedule C is the highest risk. And some examples of these products: raw milk, low acid canned or bottled food. So if you are doing canned meat, bottled meat, or even canned seafood, that's a very high risk product. You need to make sure that the processes you have in place are controlling any risks. There's another example: if you're bottling meat, canned fish, smoking fish at your home. Seafood products are not produced in a licensed facility, and the same with meat. So any products that are not processed in a licensed establishment for seafood or meat and poultry is considered a high risk product. And also potentially hazardous foods that have been stored at temperatures between 4 degrees and 60 degrees or prepared under unsanitary conditions, because that temperature of 4 and 60 is your danger zone.
Determining your food product risk level. So it's necessary to know your product and the hazards that are associated with it in order to determine the appropriate risk level. So for example, is your product a protein? Protein is a great food source for bacteria or biological hazards. What's the pH of your product? A low pH, for example, less than 4.6, it could inhibit certain biological hazards, whereas a pH of above the 4.6 could favor their growth. What's the water activity? A water activity of less than 0.85 may not support the growth of certain bacteria, but will favor their growth above a water activity of 0.85. Are there specific time and temperature requirements for your product? So does your product need to be cooked by the end consumer to control a biological hazard? So for example, raw poultry. So when we buy raw chicken at the store, it needs to be cooked to an internal temperature of 85 degrees Celsius, and it needs to be held at this temperature for 15 seconds. Is oxygen available, or is it eliminated during packing? So for example, Clostridium botulinum spores can grow in the absence of oxygen. So if you're producing something or you're packing something like, for example, raw mushrooms, you would need to ensure the packaging allows a free exchange of air to inhibit the growth of the Clostridium botulinum. You would not want to pack this kind of product into a vac pack machine or vacuum packaging, because then you would have a significant biological hazard if or when the botulism decides to grow. The answers you have to all of these types of questions, or all of these questions, these are going to help you determine the hazards that are associated with your product. So whether they're biological, chemical, or physical, and they'll help you put an effective control measure in place. There are many resources out there that can help you determine which hazards are associated with your food product if you don't have a good idea of what those are already. So here are some examples of resources that you can use to help with your risk assessment and with determining the hazards associated with your food product. So Perennia.ca, there's all kinds of information, food safety resources under our website. We also have that how to complete an effective risk assessment fact sheet, with which Carolyn shared the link to in the chat. There's also the CFIA website. They offer a reference database for hazard identification. So you can type in your list of ingredients, your product, your processes you go through, and that will generate a generic list of hazards that would be associated with your product. The FDA website also has a reference. It's called the Bad Bug Book, so you can check that out. And you can also find some more information on the USDA website, in any reference books or journals, through industry associations, and also through universities. That's also a good place to find some information.
And you can use references from other countries as well, but you have to make sure it makes sense for what you're doing. And keep in mind, even though these resources are out there, you really have to put a lens on it and look at whether or not these hazards are associated with your specific product and the process that it's going through.
Yeah, we have the Q&A function at the bottom there. Thank you, Cheryl and Shelly. I learned so much. I always learn a lot during these webinars, but I really, really appreciate them. I have a couple questions to get us started, and then if people want to chime in and add more, feel free. So if I have a risk assessment on file for not meeting a requirement, does that mean it'll be automatically accepted by an auditor and inspector? Like, who decides if this risk assessment is right?
I'll take this one. That's a great question, Carolyn. So the auditor or the inspector that is coming into your establishment is going to be the person who determines whether or not that risk assessment will be accepted. Now, keep in mind, the more thorough the risk assessment is, the more information you include. So, for example, Cheryl had an entire slide on all the things that should be included on your risk assessment. So you're going to want to put what you are risk assessing, what clause or regulatory requirement is this for, who is part of the risk assessment team, so who's gone through this risk assessment, describe the risk and the potential hazards, look at all the control measures that you currently have in place, then look at it through that assessment chart where you're looking at the likelihood and the severity, and then the criticality and the detectability of that risk. So all of that should be part of your risk assessment template. And then based on this information, you're going to determine whether or not you have to put additional control measures in place and come up with a conclusion. So the more information you have on your risk assessment, the more likely it is to be accepted. But at the end of the day, it is that inspector or the auditor who says whether or not they will accept that.
When you do a corrective action, say because you identified a risk, you did a risk assessment, you put in place a corrective action, does that corrective action also require a risk assessment?
So it all depends on the corrective action itself. We generally like to say if the issue is a food safety risk, it is recommended you document your risk assessment to show what measures were taken to define your risk and its hazards. You want to show how you evaluated it, how you managed it, and how it was validated. So it's always a good support documentation to have to show what the risk hazards are, what controls were already in place, what controls you need to put in place, and overall, what was the evaluation of whether or not the controls are effective in addressing your risk and its hazards.
Thank you. Here's one more question. I sent earlier the CFIA establishment-based risk assessment questionnaire. You talked about it, helps you determine your risk level. So what should you include and omit when completing that questionnaire?
So as I mentioned, you want to be as truthful as possible on that questionnaire because it is going to help CFIA determine what category you're in. Are you in category 1, that's high, or are you in category 7? So if you're saying that you sell internationally and you don't, that's up in your risk if you only sell within Nova Scotia. So some of the things that you're going to want to make sure you're filling out properly is the type of activity that you're doing, what commodity, the types of products, the volume. That's another good one. Like how much volume are you processing and are you distributing? And then, of course, are you sending it to vulnerable populations? Is it going to healthcare? Is it being sold outside of Nova Scotia? And then all your mitigation risks as well. So you have a regulatory inspection with CFIA, you have third-party certifications, you also have customers coming in doing audits, you have a QA manager, you have QA technicians. All of this information is going to help you in the end. So we do have a lot of clients who say, "Oh, well, I don't want to put that because if they know I have a third-party certification, then they might ask for more information." CFIA is only going to come in and do their inspection based on that integrated the CFIA integrated agency model where they're looking at certain elements. So they'll come in and look for your sanitation and you provide them with that documentation. So by telling them that you have a third-party certification is actually in your favor. So don't withhold that information.
I'll go one last question before we move on to our final conclusion. Where do you even start with risk assessments in your facility? That might be a very big question, but like, how do you begin, I guess? Or how do you recommend you begin?
So I'll start out by saying, so I'm going to brag up our fact sheet again on the how to complete an effective risk assessment. So Carolyn did post that in the chat. The fact sheet actually provides step-by-step guidance on how to complete your risk assessment. It does include everything that needs to be documented. So it's a great tool for getting started. So first you want to use a team. So build a team, use a team, grab some people, just don't do it alone. You want to start by documenting a description of your risk and the associated hazards that we talked about. You also want to identify what control measures you already have in place to reduce or eliminate that risk, and document your evaluation of the risk hazard. So you want to include the risk rating, as well as a brief statement on justifying why you chose the ratings you did. You also want to list out any additional control measures that you may have come across that you do need to implement to fully control that hazard and risks. And then you want to have your team review and sign off on the completed risk assessment. And don't forget to go back afterwards. So once everything's in place, all your new control measures are in place, you always want to go back and do an effectiveness check or a validation to make sure what you did put in place is actually effective. At this time, if you do find you have any corrective actions or improvements that you need to make, you also want to confirm that those will be completed once they've been identified, and document those corrective actions on your risk assessment as well. And last but not least, so keep your documented risk assessment on file so you can reference it if you need to, whether it's during an inspection or an audit, or just to have on file as support.
And I just want to add to that it is really helpful if the third-party certification that you have in place, whether it's SQF or BRCGS or IFS, you go in, if you have an electronic copy of it, do a control find and type in the word risk assessment. For each of those clauses, if it says you have to have a risk assessment, they want you to have a documented risk assessment on file. So I'll give you an example. Some of those third-party certifications want you to do a risk assessment if you have any piping overhead. So you must have that risk assessment on file. Another example would be of your PPE. So the clothing that the employees are wearing, they want you to do a risk assessment for that. So it is in your best interest to go in there and look for the word risk assessment, and wherever you see that, have that formal documented risk assessment on file.
Great. Thank you so much for answering these questions. And I mentioned again, and I put it in the chat, if you think of a question after you're watching this and you're like, oh, I forgot to ask that, or I didn't think of it, please send us an email. Our team, we have Cheryl, we have Shelly, we have other team members that are ready and willing to help. So, Cheryl, do you want to go over this?
Yes, I'll outline a few of Perennia's services. So our team consists of several different departments. So we have our agri services. This team provides services to growers and farmers with livestock. Our Innovation Center, they provide product and process development services. They'll help you with any troubleshooting if you want to do scale ups, that kind of thing. Seafood services, this team provides services to the seafood sector. They can help address industry-wide challenges. They also help provide scale ups and can assist with value-added product development. And last but not least is our team. So the quality and food safety team. So there's 4 of us on the quality and food safety team. This includes Shelly and I, as you know, and there's also Elaine Grant and Amanda Cameron. They're also on our team. So we can all help you out with any kind of assessments you may need for your program. So whether that's a needs assessment, a gap assessment, a pre-audit assessment, any kind of assessment to meet regulatory or third-party requirements, we can help you out with that. We also offer quality and food safety coaching, in which we can assist you with your corrective action plans. If you need a HACCP validation study, HACCP reassessment, and recall and traceability support. We also provide overall general quality and food safety support to help you with any part of your quality and food safety management system. We can also assist with the development and implementation of a HACCP-based quality and food safety management system, whether that's to meet regulatory requirements or to meet third-party standards such as GFSI certification. And we also provide internal auditing. So all of us quality and food safety specialists, we are certified food safety and quality auditors, and we all hold a CFS QA certification. And something relatively new that we offer is free technical advice for all Nova Scotia-based food and beverage companies. So let's talk. So you can give us a call or send us an email at the foodsafety@perennia.ca email address. Here you'll have direct access to all of us, all of our quality and food safety specialists. We can help you with all your problem solving or troubleshooting. We can answer any general quality and food safety questions. We can provide support to you with your nonconformities or your root cause analysis. We can answer any general questions related to your preventive controls or your prerequisite programs or your HACCP development and implementation challenges to help you determine whether you're headed in the right direction, or we can give you some advice to make sure we get you back on the right page. We can help you interpret any requirements, or we can help clear up uncertainties that you may have with your regulatory customer and or certification requirements. And we can also help provide support with specific product requirements. So if you have any questions at all related to quality and food safety, please feel free to give us a shout.
And I want to mention that's not limited to quality and food safety either. We also take product development questions, regulatory food safety, for food and beverage and seafood as well.
Okay. And as we wrap up, as Carolyn mentioned, I deliver the training for the quality and food safety team here at Perennia. So we just wrapped up the root cause analysis in February. And next week, we have the offering for developing your internal auditing skills. Another thing people don't realize is a lot of these courses are virtual. So you can take these from your facility or from your home, whatever works for you. And if the course is a full day, we break it into 2 half days so that you're able to work on the production floor as well as take your training and meet any professional development requirements that you have. So upcoming courses, seafood, food safety awareness, that's specific to seafood and seafood HACCP is March 18th to the 20th. Developing and implementing preventive controls prerequisite program that's coming up. That is an in-person and it is 2 full days. Developing a HACCP plan is also coming up in April. That is also in person and it is 2 full days. We have a HACCP refresher. So this course is for those of you who already have HACCP training. It is a refresher. It's basically a crash course in HACCP, whereas the developing a HACCP course is 2 full days. So the refresher is just a half a day. And then the seafood food safety, that's being offered twice in the year. The next root cause session is being offered in September. And then we have our HACCP training, of course, being offered in the fall again, and another internal auditing, and then senior management training is being offered in November. So all of these training you can register online. If you are an FBA member, they offer 25% off the training. So you contact them for a discount code and you simply put that discount code in when registering and you will save 25% off. And we also have discounts for those of you who register more than 3 people in these courses. So last but not least, I do want to bring up the Food Ventures funding opportunity. So this program provides financial support for the acceleration of innovative and safe Nova Scotian local products. So it is only offered to Nova Scotia-based companies, food and beverage-based companies, as well as registered farms and agri-food companies. So what this program offers is technical support. We do resource development and training. These webinars that we are providing free of charge are all covered under the Food Ventures program. So this is a cost shared funding program, and I'm sure Carolyn is going to put that information in the chat for you. And the next application period is tentatively opening on April 1. And if you want more information, you can always go to our website and click on the Food Ventures program info.
That's a lot of links I put in the chat right there. But like I said, if you didn't get a chance to ask a question or you didn't get a chance to take note of one of these links or fact sheets or whatever, just let us know and we'll find them for you, and we'll send them to you. I also want to mention that the Developing Your Internal Auditor Skills is happening next week, and I extended the deadline. So if you do want to sign up for that training session, I highly recommend it. We have had hundreds of happy participants, and it's open there for you folks if you'd like to join. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Like I mentioned, this will go up on YouTube. Thank you, Cheryl and Shelly, for your insights, and everybody who asked really, really helpful questions. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.